Okay, so afternoon, everyone who is attending this webinar live. And as always, morning, afternoon, good evening if you are watching the recording. As you all know, we're going to be diving into the gut-brain axis today, something which I think many of us are at least familiar with the term and the concept. Many of us might be familiar that the gut-brain axis or dysfunction in the gut-brain axis is thought to be a common underlying issue when we're struggling with chronic gut issues. Maybe we've received a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. Maybe we've been diagnosed with an inflammatory bowel disease. And there's plenty of research showing us that the gut-brain axis is one of the things that we need to be thinking about and one of the things that we might need to support as a way to improve the underlying condition. So I don't actually have a slide introducing me. I think I should probably still add these because I'm sure some of you, this is your first Healthpath webinar. So my name is Alex. I am one of the co-founders here at Healthpath, and my background is in functional medicine and nutritional therapy. So I graduated from the Institute for Functional Medicine in 2016, and I have a master's degree in personalized nutrition. I actually did my dissertation in cortisol resistance and chronic fatigue syndrome. So I've done a lot of clinical work with chronic fatigue syndrome, but the area that I've certainly done the most in is around gut health. And I think that's partly because I have a long personal history of gut issues, really from day one of my life. When I was 18, I was diagnosed with IBS. When I was about 23, at the beginning of my nutritional therapy training, it was through doing a SIBO test that it was confirmed that actually I had small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And then I spent my 20s on quite a journey to understand as much as possible the role that diet, lifestyle, stress management, hypnotherapy can play within gut health, and also vice versa. And what I mean by that is the role that gut health can play in mood and our emotional well-being, as well as skin health. And as many of us know, there are very few conditions that we probably can't bring back to the gut microbiome, at least to some degree. The gut is a central hub of systemic health, ultimately. So the objectives today are to very quickly give everyone a good understanding of what actually the gut-brain axis is, because in some ways, the axis is made up of different axes or different pathways, all of which we know a little bit about, and all of which that we can modify, manipulate, improve via lifestyle changes. And by the end of today, I'm hoping that you'll have a general understanding of what might contribute to dysfunction within this axis, what conditions are associated with dysfunction in the axis, and most importantly, things that we can do in our day-to-day lives that will be beneficial to the gut-brain axis. So to make sure we are all on the same page, starting with what is it? Well, the gut-brain axis is a bidirectional pathway between the gut and the brain. And we know there are at least four routes, four mechanisms, four different ways that connect the gut and the brain. So in the middle of this image, you will see a purple line, and that is labeled as the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve leaves the brainstem, sort of the base slightly towards the back of our brain, and it branches out into our torso. And the vagus nerve innervates. It is essentially communicating and to some degree controlling the digestive system, our heart, our liver, our adrenals, our pancreas. Vagus in Latin means wandering. If you think of a big oak tree, and if you think about the root system of that oak tree, the root system is going to look quite similar to the vagus nerve. It literally branches out into our entire torso. So we have a neurological pathway between the gut and the brain, the vagus nerve. On the left-hand side, you can see cortisol. Many of us will know cortisol as being one of our stress hormones, but it also has a huge role to play within our immune system. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone. Think of corticosteroids in a hospital setting. So we have a hormonal pathway, and cortisol is just one example of a hormone that sort of influences the gut and the brain in both directions. As a very simple example, we have studies in humans, in fact, military men and women going through their training, which is obviously both physically and psychologically stressful. And we see an imbalance developing within the microbiome, what we call dysbiosis, and also an increase in the permeability of the gut, aka leaky gut. So we know that stress and the stress hormones that are produced in response to that perception of stress are incredibly damaging when produced at inappropriate levels over an inappropriate amount of time. And I say that quite specifically because stress is a natural part of our existence. We wouldn't be here without the stress response. So this concept of chronic stress, I think, is important just to sort of reiterate. We then have what I just refer to as kind of a metabolomic pathway or a metabolite pathway. And this is on the right-hand side. So this is really referring to the fact that our bacteria in the gut produce all sorts of different metabolites. The two here, neurotransmitters like serotonin, which often is described as our happy hormone, and short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are produced by bacteria when they ferment, in particular, our dietary fiber. A well-known short-chain fatty acid is butyrate. Butyrate is a fatty acid that helps maintain a healthy gut lining, i.e. we need appropriate amounts of this fatty acids to not have leaky gut, so to speak. The fourth pathway is middle to the left of the vagus nerve. You'll see the word cytokines, and cytokines are produced by immune cells, and they're basically inflammatory mediators. They're messages that the immune system is producing, and they orchestrate the immune response. So we have pro-inflammatory cytokines and we have anti-inflammatory cytokines. And obviously we need a balance between the two to maintain health. What we see in some research is people with IBS, for example, can have elevated levels of some of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, indicating that a subset of people with IBS have just low level systemic inflammation, which is one of the reasons why there's such a strong connection between IBS and depression or low mood. So the gut-brain axis is actually made up of four pathways: a nervous system pathway, an immune system pathway, a stress system pathway, and then a metabolite pathway. And all of these to some degree are actually interconnected, but it's a nice way to kind of just break it down mechanistically and think about this process. So one of the things that we're going to do today is kind of just look at each of these four in a little bit of an isolated manner to help you understand what we can do to support them. Now, some of the research goes one step further, and again, this is maybe a bit pedantic and it's all about just terminology, but technically we are talking about the microbiota gut-brain axis or the microbiome gut-brain axis, because the gut in ways other than just the bacteria can influence brain structure and brain function. So we have bacteria in the gut, we have the gut itself that could be related to maybe the stomach, or as we've already mentioned, the gut lining, which is kind of to some degree independent of the bacteria that are within the gut. And that makes sense when we think about the metabolites as well. Now, context is also key. So when we think about the gut microbiome, I think social media, blogs, the media itself, they often get us to believe or think that it's kind of almost all about what we're eating. And what we know is that what we're eating has a noticeable, significant impact on the microbiome, but there are a whole bunch of other environmental factors that we need to be aware of. We've mentioned that psychological and physical stress has been shown in humans to cause imbalances within our gut. And then we've got the obvious things like processed and ultra-processed foods that make up sort of the typical Western diets. We have certain food additives that we know can create imbalances within our microbiome. Advanced glycation end products are things that can be created within the cooking process that if we're having too many of, especially with a lack of phytochemicals, things like fruit and vegetables, can be problematic. If we don't have enough essential fatty acids or omega-3 fatty acids found in things like salmon, mackerel, and sardines, then that can contribute to imbalances within our gut bacteria. A vitamin D deficiency, a magnesium deficiency, a zinc deficiency could all impact the gut bacteria. If we've had too many courses of antibiotics, that may have led to a long-term disruption, as we all know. We're starting to understand that our oral microbiome, the microbiome that we have in our mouth, is incredibly important for systemic health. There are some really strong links between dysbiosis or an imbalance in the oral microbiome and metabolic disease like diabetes, and also neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. And when working with practitioners at this point in time, you may have the sort of option, so to speak, of doing an oral microbiome test if it was appropriate, because of this strong connection between the health of our mouth and the health of our body. If we are too sedentary, or if we're spending too much time indoors, whether that's in front of a screen or whether it's just indoors, this has been shown to impact our gut microbiome. We have lived most of our evolution outside. We are outdoor creatures, and we should be under the sun a lot more than we are. And again, there's very good research showing us that that's the case. Tobacco use, alcohol use, issues with our circadian rhythm. If you're up till midnight on a regular basis or worse, that is problematic for your gut health. And that's problematic for most things fundamentally. Crowding, living in an inner city, in a really urban, busy environment, has been shown to be problematic for both the gut microbiome but our health overall. Climatic stress through different mechanisms and environmental toxins. Maybe two common examples from my experience would be someone who's got a lot of amalgam fillings and the mercury has leaked out of the mouth or out of the teeth and into the bloodstream. Or mycotoxins and molds. If someone's living in a property that has mold or has had a water leak or water damage that hasn't been properly remediated, and they're breathing in these toxins that we know can contribute to illness. So we have to think about the bigger picture, as well as thinking about some of the micro details that often we really like to get into. So another way of thinking about this is just our microbiome over a lifetime. We know it does change a little bit. Some research would indicate we have a core microbiome, which doesn't change that much unless we do some significant changes to lifestyle. And then we have this peripheral microbiome that is constantly changing based on our thoughts, our emotions, what we're eating, literally really everything in our environment, inside and outside. So how many courses of antibiotics have you had? Were you breastfed or bottle fed, vaginal delivery at birth or a C-section? Have you had many chronic infections? How much stress have you had over your life? What other environmental influences that we've just listed are relevant for some stage of your life? And don't forget that our genetics seem to influence to some degree our microbiome as well. There are a few bacteria I know that seem to be quite heavily influenced by our genetics, meaning you likely have a good amount of it with certain genes, and variants of those genes will likely mean that you don't have much of a certain bacteria. Now, a fascinating thing to appreciate about the gut-brain axis is that 80 to 90%, so today I actually read it's 80%, 80 to 90% of information being transported along the gut-brain axis is going from the gut to the brain. And most people, quite rightly or understandably, would think that it's brain to gut. We think of the brain as this central hub of communication governing everything. And in many ways it is, but 80 to 90% of the information is actually going from our body to the brain. So the brain is receiving all of this information about the state and the sensations that we're experiencing. And then 10 to 20% of that sort of information is going into the body, telling us, I guess, what to do ultimately. So I thought that was just quite a fascinating statistic. Now, before we dive into these different pathways that we've summarized that kind of make up the gut-brain axis, it's also important to appreciate when we talk about the gut-brain axis, we're talking about the whole gut. And the gut, I would argue, let's call it the digestive system, starts at the mouth and finishes at the anus. We've already mentioned the role of the oral mouth microbiome in systemic health. Many of us are familiar with the bacterium H. pylori that can inhabit the stomach and can either hang around there causing no issues whatsoever, but it's also been associated with things like gastric ulcers and gastric cancer. Many of us are definitely going to be familiar with the concept of SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and then the large intestine, where we can have various types of imbalances, bacterial deficiencies, bacterial overgrowths, infections, inflammation, and intestinal permeability. And imbalances at any stage of this entire digestive system can lead to an inflammatory response, which can then impact our moods, for example, which could impact a certain autoimmune condition. Maybe it leads into rheumatoid arthritis, for example. It could be depression, anxiety, brain fog, psoriasis, or other skin-based conditions. You know, the list goes on and on. So let's go and look at the vagus nerve in a little bit more detail. So the vagus nerve actually makes up the main component of our parasympathetic nervous system. If people aren't yet familiar with this term, if you think of your nervous system, you have your central nervous system, kind of your brain and spine, and then you've got your peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can be broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And what we mean by this is it can be broken down into the fight or flight response when we are experiencing stress, or what some people refer to as the rest and digest response. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest response. It is the part of the nervous system that, put simply, we want to spend more time in. We're not going to be able to digest our food if we're in a fight or flight response. We're not going to be able to sleep very well if we're in a fight or flight response. We're not actually going to be able to think very well if we're in a chronic fight or flight response. So a lot of us, because of the fast-paced lives and the world that we live in, which quite frankly can be quite stressful day to day, I would argue that a lot of us these days need tools and strategies and skills to support our mind and body dropping into the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. And we're going to be discussing exercises and things we can do to activate the vagus nerve, to improve the tone of the vagus nerve, which means that we're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which means we're providing an anti-inflammatory impact on our mind and body. So the vagus nerve is incredibly important within all of this. So just as an example, vagus nerve stimulation, which can be done invasively or non-invasively. Invasively is when you're literally going in for surgery and having something implanted in your body, very invasive. Or non-invasive, one of them where you attach a little gadget, I'll describe it as, to your left earlobe. And we actually know that you can activate the vagus nerve via this approach as well. So in research, we see that this vagus nerve stimulation can actually be quite a powerful add-on treatment in treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and inflammatory bowel disease. And that's because it's increasing vagal tone, it's activating the vagus nerve, and as a result, reducing inflammatory or pro-inflammatory cytokines that we mentioned earlier. And we know that depression, PTSD, and IBD all have inflammation as part of the underlying issue. And there has never been a time in our entire evolution whereby the nervous system hasn't received signals from bugs, bacteria, for example. We are very much entwined with the microbiome. And something that you just can't stress enough is that our health, our gut microbiome health, is absolutely dependent on the microbiome that we live in. And what I mean by that, or an example of this, is we know that people living in a rural environment have a greater microbiome diversity to those living in an urban environment. So if you are living in quite a sterile world, we are going to be more sterile. And we know in the research that from a planetary perspective, we are seeing a depletion in the microbiome. The planet has a microbiome that is being mirrored in our microbiome. We are losing bugs because of the use of antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides, and the way we live our lives, etc. And I just think it's really important for us to understand the interconnection. It's potentially one of the reasons and mechanisms behind why spending time in nature is just so healthy for us. We see significant drops in anxiety, depression, inflammation, stress hormones, blood pressure, heart rate, etc. Now, the good news is we can actually monitor the vagus nerve. Some of you might already be doing this. There are lots of different apps and gadgets out there. Many of you might be familiar with the Aura Ring, literally a ring that you wear that is able to monitor something called your heart rate variability. Your heart rate variability, as the name suggests, is the variability in time between each heartbeat. So I keep this very simple. And the way I describe this is, let's just say you have a heart rate of 60 beats a minute. We have no idea if that heart is beating on the second every second for 60 seconds, like a metronome, or if it's beating, put very simply, once in a second, twice in a second, 0 times for a second, once for a second, and there's variability. Now, a lot of people, and again, understandably, think that we should have a heartbeat that is like a metronome, but actually we want variability. If we were to monitor it, we want to see variability in time between each heartbeat. Now, various apps, like the two I picture here, use the phone and sometimes a Bluetooth belt that you sometimes see like marathon runners wear, and it picks up your heart rate. And using the technology within the app that you download, it often will give you a score from 0 to 10. And put simply, the higher the number, the more rest and digest parasympathetic you are. The lower the number, the more sympathetic fight or flight you are. And your heart rate variability, basically the score you get from these apps, is giving you insight into your vagus nerve and the health of your vagus nerve. So you want something like 7.5 in a lot of these apps. That we know in the research is a good heart rate variability. But you also expect it to fluctuate based on your lifestyle. So if you have a deadline at work and you're really stressed and working longer hours, your heart rate variability should drop. Maybe it goes to a 6 or a 5. And that tells you that actually you need to really try and slow down and relax, and maybe you need to go to an extra yoga class that week, or maybe you need to do a little bit of meditation or breath work, something to support your body, because your biology is telling you that you're under a state of stress. What I found, especially in my sort of CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome clients, is they actually often have very high numbers, like 9.5, that just doesn't change. They have lost that variability, and they're actually stuck in very much a parasympathetic state. And what I found is that a lot of these clients, when they do go and experience stress in their day or lifestyle, their heart rate variability can't change. They've lost resiliency. They've lost adaptability in their physiology. And that's one of the reasons why they're unwell. You know, I love the concept of resiliency. Resiliency is defined as the ability to bounce back from an adverse event, from a stressor. Whenever we're unwell, you could put quite simply that we have lost resiliency in some shape or form. Some part of our physiology, some part of our psychology sometimes has lost adaptability and flexibility. So you can go onto the App Store, you can go online and search for heart rate variability monitors and see which one resonates. There are a lot out there these days, but it's a great way of understanding what's going on with the vagus nerve if you are into this kind of thing. Then we have the metabolic pathway. So these were the metabolites that we discussed, like neurotransmitters, serotonin, and short chain fatty acids like butyrate. Now, we could do a whole webinar really on each of these. So I'm kind of picking up what I feel are key examples. So an example of the metabolic pathway in the gut-brain axis is tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid. It's found in bananas and oats and all sorts of different foods at different levels. And tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. Serotonin is often described as our happy hormone or happy neurotransmitter. Serotonin can be converted to melatonin. Melatonin is often thought of as our sleep hormone, which it is, but it's also one of the most potent antioxidants that we have in our bodies. Now, if you are experiencing excessive amounts of stress, or if you are inflamed chronically, there is an upregulation of a couple of enzymes that are just shortened to IDO and TIDO, IDO, TDO. These enzymes essentially result in a deficiency in serotonin. The tryptophan metabolic pathway starts to break down, so to speak. And without enough serotonin, you have GI alterations that can contribute to constipation, as just one example. But you might also start to experience mood-based disorders like a bit of depression. It might just be low mood. It might not go all the way to a diagnosis of depression. So inflammation and chronic stress, or anything that is leading to an upregulation in your stress hormones, is influencing this pathway and can impact the gut and your mood. Now, we know there are certain strains of bacteria that can produce serotonin. So some of these may actually be helpful in regards to mood as well. But bear in mind that if you have an overgrowth of any of these strains of bacteria, that may be meaning that you have an excess amount of serotonin, which can contribute to GI symptoms. So it's all about balance at the end of the day. The second, and I think final example on the metabolic pathways, butyrate. So there's a lot of research out there on butyrate, and look at the conditions that it's sort of being associated with. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, stroke, metabolic disorders, meaning things like diabetes and insulin resistance, autism, psychological disorders like depression, a short chain fatty acids that's produced either by a high fiber diet, or weirdly enough, some researchers will say a really low fiber diet. So we know that there is a slightly different type of butyrate that is produced at good levels when people are on a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet is one that is incredibly high in fat, where you're often consuming 25 grams of carbohydrate a day tops, which is just nothing. So you're eating vast quantities of fat. But you do produce a slightly different type of butyrate in that state, which may have very similar properties to the butyrate we produce when we're eating lots of fiber, which is really interesting, and maybe one of the reasons why the ketogenic diet has some research behind it in improving kind of neurological health, for example. So the takeaway message here is that for most of us, we probably want to be focusing on, as to the best of our ability, incorporating more fiber into the diet through incorporating more variety into our diet to support butyrate, which is a metabolite of bacteria that helps maintain a healthy gut lining. It's actually a source of calories for us as the host. But there's also some research suggesting that butyrate has like a systemic health benefit as well, including in the brain. Oh, there is one more. So this, I'm going to keep this very simple because I don't want to confuse people, but the takeaway message here is that we have various neurotransmitters, 5-HTP, which converts to serotonin, for example, L-DOPA that gets converted to dopamine, for example, which is important for focus and concentration and rewards. To produce these neurotransmitters requires amino acids. We just spoke 2 slides ago about tryptophan and how tryptophan can be converted to serotonin and then to melatonin. We have other amino acids that convert to some of these other neurotransmitters. For this process to work appropriately, we need various B vitamins like folate. We also can't have excessive amounts of inflammation or oxidative stress, which are both the result of various things: psychological stress, infections, imbalances in the microbiome, leaky gut, environmental toxins, poor diet, lack of sleep. These things that can contribute to inflammation can then actually impact our ability to convert basically our food into important compounds in the body. So I'm just kind of stressing the importance of sort of, if I use the term, stress management within the gut-brain axis. Now the hormone pathway. The example we'll give here is the HPA axis, which is referring to our adrenal glands and part of the stress system. We know that if we perceive stress, a message is sent to the adrenal glands to produce more cortisol and adrenaline. And if this stays upregulated because we perceive stress over a period of time, it can contribute to, as mentioned earlier, leaky gut, dysbiosis, inflammation, and then that can contribute to a host of symptoms based on our overall health status and genetics as well. So I've said before on webinars that I have a, how should I put it? I have like a tendency to psoriasis. I had a lot of acne, psoriasis, eczema in the first sort of 10 years of my life. And then again, a little bit in my teenage years when I found alcohol and wasn't living the most particularly healthy lifestyle back then. But what I know now is that if my self-care is not very good, and more importantly, if I'm stressed, then I can start to get some of those psoriasis symptoms back. So stress is just a deal breaker, and it's almost like stress will show us our weaknesses wherever those may be. For some people, that could be joints. So when they're not managing their stress very well, they start to feel almost a bit more kind of achy and arthritic-like. For others, it could be more cognitive. For me, it's a mixture of kind of gut and skin. And then the immune pathway. So an example that I'll use here is that we have something called gram-negative bacteria in our large intestine. We all have them. They're meant to be there. But on their surface, gram-negative bacteria have something called LPS, lipopolysaccharides. And if we have too many of these, or if they're able to penetrate a leaky gut wall, they trigger an immune response, meaning they trigger inflammation. That inflammation can sometimes impact brain inflammation, and brain inflammation contributes to a whole bunch of kind of brain-based symptoms and conditions, such as Alzheimer's disease. So this is the best example, I think, of the immune pathway in the gut-brain axis. If the gut is triggering inflammation via some of the things that we've just mentioned, then we're going to experience issues from a neurological nervous system perspective. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because I don't think it's sort of helpful as such, but hopefully some of you find it sort of interesting. And that's conditions associated with this. And this is probably the best paper I could find that was the most comprehensive. So some of this is obvious and a lot of it we've already covered. So I'm not going to kind of list this too often, but have a quick look at these conditions ranging from just IBS through to schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease, stress-based conditions, metabolic, etc. So we've got a lot of conditions that can be caused or can be partly caused by issues in the gut-brain axis. One of the things with fatigue and therefore chronic fatigue syndrome is what we've already mentioned. Whenever I share my screen, I lose my cursor, so unfortunately I can't point to things. But if you look on the left-hand side, just under half of the way down, you'll see BH4, TRP, KYN in yellow and red arrows pointing down. Well, we've just spoken about BH4. I didn't mention it, but this is when we spoke about amino acids being sort of metabolized or being converted into neurotransmitters and BH4 being needed for that. We mentioned tryptophan and we mentioned kynurenic acid. Kynurenic acid is a neurotoxin that increases as the enzymes go down, converting tryptophan to serotonin. So this relays back to what we've already discussed. The mechanisms are there from a fatigue perspective. Depression. One of the ways that depression can be caused is through a leaky gut, creating systemic inflammation, and then that impacting the brain.